I met Kevin Marshall at the ferry terminal in Portsmouth on a grey October morning 5 years ago. What I'm about to tell you happened to my closest friend, and I've never shared this story with anyone until now. Kevin thought his secret was safe, buried somewhere in the tropical heat of Thailand. He was wrong. If you think you know how far someone will go to destroy a life, think again. Hit that subscribe button now, because this story will change how you view trust forever. Kevin Marshall was 53 years old when his world collapsed. A successful architect from Manchester, he'd spent 30 years building other people's dreams, while his own marriage crumbled brick by brick. His wife Sarah had filed for divorce 6 months earlier, citing irreconcilable differences. What she really meant was that Kevin had become a stranger in his own home, working 16-hour days to avoid confronting the emptiness that had grown between them like a cancer. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday. By Friday, Kevin had booked a flight to Thailand. He told everyone it was a sabbatical, a chance to clear his head and find inspiration for his architectural firm. The truth was simpler and more desperate. He was running away from the ruins of his life, hoping that tropical sunshine could heal wounds that Manchester rain had only deepened. Koh Samui welcomed him with open arms and blazing heat. Kevin checked into a modest beachfront resort. Nothing fancy, just clean rooms and a view of turquoise water that seemed to stretch into infinity. For the first week, he did what every heartbroken man does on a solo vacation. He drank too much beer, read thriller novels under palm trees, and pretended that the ache in his chest was just heartburn from spicy Thai food. It was during his second week that Kevin met Monthira. She was working at a small internet cafe near Fisherman's Village, helping tourists navigate visa applications and booking flights. 28 years old, with long black hair that caught the light like silk, she had the kind of smile that made grown men forget their own names. When Kevin walked in to check his emails, struggling with the slow Wi-Fi connection, Monthira appeared beside him like an angel of efficiency. Her English was perfect, tinged with a slight British accent she'd picked up from international customers. She helped him upload photos to send to his architectural firm, making small talk about his work and his travels. Kevin found himself lingering, ordering unnecessary coffee refills just to hear her laugh. When she asked if he'd like a local guide to show him the real Koh Samui, beyond the tourist traps, Kevin said yes before his rational mind could object. Their first date, if you could call it that, was supposed to be a simple tour of hidden temples and local markets. Monthira picked him up on her motorbike, and Kevin spent the day clinging to her waist as they wound through jungle paths and village streets that no guidebook had ever mentioned. She showed him a waterfall where Buddhist monks came to meditate, a family-run restaurant where they served curry that made his eyes water and his soul sing, and a sunset viewpoint where the sky turned colors that didn't have names in English. Pause here for a moment. I want you to think about what seems suspicious in this story so far. Write in the comments what red flags you're already noticing, because trust me, they're there if you know where to look. Kevin felt alive for the first time in months. Monthira was intelligent, curious about his life in England, and genuinely interested in his architectural work. She asked thoughtful questions about building design, about the challenges of working with historical preservation, about his dreams beyond the divorce paperwork. When she touched his arm while laughing at his jokes, Kevin felt electricity that he'd forgotten existed. The romance blossomed with tropical intensity. Within days, they were inseparable, Monteira would finish her shifts at the internet cafe and meet Kevin at his hotel. They'd walk the night markets hand in hand, sharing plates of mango sticky rice and bottles of Chang beer. She taught him basic Thai phrases, giggling when his Manchester accent mangled the tones. He sketched buildings for her, showing her how he saw the world through an architect's eyes. Kevin extended his vacation. 1 week became 2, then 3. He moved from the hotel to a small apartment that Monteira helped him find. A place where they could have privacy, away from curious tourists and hotel staff. The apartment was basic but comfortable, with a balcony overlooking a fishing village where long-tail boats bobbed like toys in the harbor. Their intimacy grew as naturally as the tropical flowers that bloomed outside their window. Monteira was affectionate but never pushy, passionate but mysteriously reserved about certain aspects of her past. She lived with her elderly grandmother, she said, and worked 2 jobs to support them both. The internet cafe was just one source of income. She also did translation work for local businesses and occasionally guided small tour groups. Kevin admired her work ethic and independence. After years with Sarah, who had grown bitter about money and security, Monteira's gratitude for simple pleasures was refreshing. A meal at a street stall delighted her. A small gift from the night market made her eyes shine with genuine happiness. When Kevin offered to help with her grandmother's medical expenses, Monteira initially refused, saying she couldn't accept charity from someone she cared about. But life on Koh Samui was expensive for foreigners, and Kevin's extended stay was draining his savings faster than he'd anticipated. Restaurant meals, hotel bills, and constant tourist pricing were adding up. When Monteira finally accepted his offer to help with her grandmother's medication, Kevin felt useful in a way that his marriage had never provided. He was solving problems, making a difference in someone's life, being needed rather than merely tolerated. The first troubling sign came during their 4th week together. Kevin had been drinking heavily one evening, celebrating a successful video call with his architectural firm. A major project had been approved, securing his financial stability for the next year. Monteira had been taking photos throughout the evening, claiming she wanted to document their happiness. Kevin barely noticed, lost in whiskey and relief, and the intoxicating presence of a woman who seemed genuinely proud of his success. He woke up the next morning with gaps in his memory and a hangover that felt like construction equipment operating inside his skull. Monteira was already gone, off to her morning shift at the internet cafe. Kevin found his phone on the bedside table, and when he scrolled through the photos from the night before, he felt a cold shock of embarrassment. There were dozens of pictures he didn't remember taking, images of him shirtless, images of them together in compromising positions, images that would be mortifying if anyone else saw them. He deleted them immediately, chalking it up to drunken stupidity and tourist behavior he'd rather forget. But Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Monteira had been sober during their celebration, claiming she had to work early the next morning. She'd been the one handling his phone, taking most of the photos. When he mentioned the embarrassing pictures, she laughed it off, saying that everyone took silly photos when they were happy and drunk. The second warning sign came a week later. Kevin had given Monteira his laptop password so she could help him organize his architectural portfolio for a client presentation. When he opened his email the next day, he discovered that several intimate messages had been sent from his account to an email address he didn't recognize. The messages contained personal details about his divorce, his loneliness, and his growing feelings for Monthira. When confronted, Monthira seemed genuinely confused and concerned. She suggested that Kevin's laptop might have been hacked at one of the public Wi-Fi spots they'd visited together. It was a reasonable explanation, and Kevin wanted desperately to believe it. He changed his passwords and tried to push down the growing unease that settled in his stomach like a stone. Their relationship continued to deepen despite these troubling incidents. Monthira introduced Kevin to her friends, a close-knit group of young Thai women who worked in various aspects of the tourism industry. They welcomed him with warmth and enthusiasm, treating him like an honored guest rather than just another foreign tourist. Kevin felt accepted, valued, part of a community in a way that his life in Manchester had never provided. The friends had stories of their own relationships with foreign men, tales of romance and heartbreak that made Kevin feel less alone in his middle-aged vulnerability. Some had married their foreign boyfriends and moved abroad. Others had been left behind when vacation romances ended and real life resumed. Kevin began to see his relationship with Monthira as something more than a tropical fling. He started imagining a future that included visa applications and wedding plans. Monthira seemed to share his dreams. She talked about visiting England, meeting his friends, seeing the architectural projects he'd designed. She showed genuine interest in his work, asking detailed questions about building codes and design principles that impressed Kevin with their sophistication. When she mentioned that she'd always dreamed of studying architecture herself, but couldn't afford university, Kevin felt a surge of protective tenderness that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her. Their physical relationship became more intense and more documented. Monthira had developed a habit of taking photos during their intimate moments, claiming she wanted to preserve their memories. Kevin, intoxicated by passion and tropical heat, didn't object. He trusted her completely, believing that their love was genuine and their future together was real. The dependency grew gradually, like a vine that strangles a tree, so slowly the tree doesn't realize it's dying. Kevin found himself unable to make decisions without consulting Monthira. Where to eat, what to do, how to spend his days, which architectural projects to pursue back in England. She had opinions about everything, and Kevin valued her input with the desperate gratitude of a man who'd been starved for genuine interest in his life. Financially, the boundaries blurred as well. Kevin was supporting not just Monthira's grandmother's medical expenses, but also her rent, her motorbike payments, and various family emergencies that seemed to arise with suspicious frequency. He told himself it was temporary, that once they sorted out visa paperwork and she could join him in England, their financial arrangement would normalize. Emotionally, Kevin had never been more dependent on another person. Monthira had become his translator, his guide, his connection to everything meaningful about his life in Thailand. Without her, he was just another lost tourist, stumbling through a culture he didn't understand. With her, he felt like he belonged somewhere for the first time in decades. The psychological dependency was the most insidious. Kevin began to doubt his own perceptions and memories. When money went missing from his wallet, Monthira suggested he'd spent it and forgotten. When his laptop showed signs of unauthorized access, she reminded him that he'd been drinking heavily and might have left it unlocked. When friends from England called with concerns about his extended absence, Monthira helped him craft responses that minimized their worries while maximizing his isolation from his support network back home. Kevin's world had shrunk to the size of Koh Samui, and at the center of that world was Monthira. He couldn't imagine life without her, couldn't remember why he'd ever thought his marriage to Sarah mattered, couldn't conceive of returning to England alone. The tropical paradise that had initially offered escape had become a beautiful prison, and Kevin was a willing captive. The revelation came like a lightning strike on a clear day, sudden and devastating and completely unexpected. Kevin had been planning to propose. He'd bought a ring from a jewelry shop in Bangkok during a weekend trip. A modest but elegant piece that represented his commitment to building a future with Monthira. He was nervous, excited, terrified, and hopeful all at once. This was his second chance at love, his opportunity to get it right after failing so spectacularly with Sarah. If you've ever experienced betrayal, you know how this story ends. But if you haven't, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment about whether you've ever seen someone you cared about fall for a scam like this, because what happened next will shock you. The truth revealed itself through Kevin's own carelessness. He'd left his laptop open while taking a shower, something he'd done countless times without thinking. But this time, when he returned, he saw Monthira quickly closing a browser window and stepping away from the computer with a guilty expression that made his blood freeze. Kevin waited until she left for work, then checked his browser history. What he found destroyed not just his relationship, but his entire understanding of the past 2 months of his life. Monthira had been accessing multiple email accounts, none of which belonged to her. She'd been communicating with at least 6 other foreign men, using variations of the same romantic script she'd used with Kevin. The emails were templates, carefully crafted messages designed to build emotional dependency and extract financial support. Kevin recognized phrases she'd whispered to him during intimate moments, words he'd believed were spontaneous expressions of love. But the emails were just the beginning. Monthira had been uploading photos to cloud storage accounts, intimate images of Kevin that he'd never authorized, and some that he didn't even remember taking. The timestamps showed that many of the photos had been taken when Kevin was heavily intoxicated, poses and positions that had been carefully staged while he was too drunk to understand what was happening. The photos weren't just for her personal collection. They were organized into folders, labeled with what appeared to be client names and addresses. Kevin's folder contained not just intimate images, but also screenshots of his financial information, copies of his passport, and detailed notes about his family members and their contact information. Kevin's hands shook as he realized the scope of the deception. This wasn't a romance gone wrong or a cultural misunderstanding. This was a sophisticated operation, a systematic exploitation that had been planned from their very first meeting at the internet cafe. Every moment of their relationship had been calculated. Every gesture of affection had been performed. Every expression of love had been a lie designed to make him more vulnerable to manipulation. The final piece of evidence was an email draft that Monthira had been preparing. It was addressed to Sarah, Kevin's ex-wife, and it contained a selection of the most compromising photos, along with a detailed account of Kevin's behavior in Thailand. The message was designed to look like a concerned warning from a Thai woman who'd been victimized by Kevin's predatory behavior. It painted Kevin as a sex tourist who'd exploited and abandoned her, a narrative that would destroy not just his marriage prospects, but his professional reputation and relationship with his adult children. The draft email included a financial demand. For £5,000, Monthira would agree to keep quiet about Kevin's alleged behavior. For £10,000, she would delete all evidence and never contact his family. The email was scheduled to be sent in 3 days, giving Kevin just enough time to panic and comply with the demands. Kevin sat in the small apartment that had felt like paradise just hours earlier, staring at evidence of his own complete stupidity. Every happy memory was poisoned. Every moment of intimacy was revealed as performance. Every gesture of love was exposed as manipulation. The woman he'd planned to propose to was a professional predator, and he'd been the perfect victim. Lonely, vulnerable, desperate for connection, and far from home. The confrontation happened that evening, when Monthira returned from work with her usual bright smile and affectionate greeting. Kevin had spent hours deciding how to handle the situation, cycling through denial, anger, bargaining, and a kind of numb acceptance that felt like death. He showed her the evidence without saying a word: the browser history, the email drafts, the organized photo folders, the communications with other victims. Monthira's face went through its own cycle of emotions: surprise, confusion, hurt, and finally, a cold calculation that Kevin had never seen before. She didn't deny it. Instead, she explained it with the businesslike efficiency of someone discussing a legitimate enterprise. Kevin was one of several clients, she said. Foreign men who came to Thailand looking for easy romance and willing to pay for the fantasy. She provided companionship, affection, and memories in exchange for financial support. It was a service industry, no different from massage therapy or tour guiding. The blackmail, she explained with chilling practicality, was simply insurance. Men like Kevin often became possessive or demanding when the arrangement ended. They might stalk her, report her to authorities, or try to damage her reputation in the local community. The compromising photos and contact information for their family members served as protection, ensuring that clients would leave quietly and without causing trouble. Kevin asked about the other men, the templated emails, the systematic deception. Monthira shrugged with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. Foreign men were all the same, she said. They all wanted the same fantasy, responded to the same approaches, fell for the same carefully crafted romantic narrative. Why reinvent the wheel for each client when proven methods worked so efficiently? When Kevin asked if anything about their relationship had been real, Monthira considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness. She'd enjoyed his company, she said. He was kinder than most of her clients, more interesting to talk to, less demanding physically. If circumstances were different, if she weren't supporting her family and trying to build a future in a country where foreign tourists had all the economic advantages, maybe things could have been different. But circumstances weren't different. And Kevin was just another lonely foreign man who'd confused paid companionship with genuine love. The photos would be sent to his family in 2 days, unless he transferred £10,000 to her account. After that, he was free to leave Thailand and never contact her again. It was business, nothing personal. Kevin felt something break inside him during that conversation. Something that had nothing to do with love or betrayal, and everything to do with his fundamental understanding of human nature. He thought he was worldly, experienced, intelligent enough to recognize manipulation. Instead, he'd been played with the expertise of a master craftsman. Every weakness exploited, every vulnerability leveraged with surgical precision. The next 48 hours were the longest of Kevin's life. He considered paying the blackmail, liquidating his savings to buy silence and preserve what remained of his dignity. He considered going to the police, though Monteira had made it clear that her connections in the local community would make that a complicated and potentially dangerous choice. He considered simply leaving Thailand immediately and hoping that geographic distance would somehow protect him from consequences. But mostly, Kevin considered the man he'd been before meeting Monteira and the man he'd become after 2 months of systematic manipulation. The transformation horrified him more than the blackmail. He'd allowed himself to become dependent, desperate, vulnerable in ways that made him unrecognizable to himself. The Kevin Marshall, who'd built a successful architectural firm through careful planning and rational decision-making, had been replaced by a lovesick fool willing to believe anything that made him feel valued. The decision, when it came, surprised Kevin with its simplicity and clarity. He wasn't going to pay the blackmail, and he wasn't going to run away like a frightened child. Instead, he was going to do something that Monteira clearly hadn't expected. He was going to fight back. Kevin spent his last day in Thailand gathering his own evidence. He documented everything he'd discovered about Monteira's operation, including the names and contact information of other victims he'd found in her email accounts. He researched Thai laws regarding fraud, extortion, and immigration violations. He contacted the British Embassy in Bangkok and reported the blackmail attempt, creating an official record of the crime. Most importantly, Kevin did something that required more courage than he'd needed in decades. He called his ex-wife, Sarah, and told her everything. The conversation was excruciating. Kevin had to admit his loneliness, his desperation, his complete lack of judgment in trusting Monteira. He had to confess that he'd been photographed in compromising positions, and that those photos might be used to embarrass or manipulate their family. He had to acknowledge that his extended vacation in Thailand had been less about finding himself and more about running away from adult responsibilities. Sarah's response surprised him. Instead of anger or disgust, she expressed something closer to pity mixed with relief. She'd been worried about Kevin's mental state since their divorce, concerned that he was making self-destructive choices out of grief and loneliness. The fact that he was calling to warn her about potential blackmail, rather than simply paying it to avoid embarrassment, suggested that he was finally thinking clearly again. Together, they developed a plan. Sarah would alert Kevin's adult children and close friends about the potential for malicious communications, framing it as a scam targeting vulnerable tourists rather than a reflection of Kevin's character. Kevin would report the blackmail attempt to British and Thai authorities, providing evidence that might help other victims. They would both document everything, creating a paper trail that would make it difficult for Monteira to escalate her threats without incriminating herself. The plan wasn't perfect, and it couldn't undo the damage to Kevin's dignity or self-respect, but it was rational, proactive, and based on facing consequences rather than avoiding them. For the first time in months, Kevin felt like himself again. When Monteira's deadline arrived, Kevin was already on a flight back to Manchester. He'd left a letter at her apartment explaining his decision and providing contact information for the British Embassy case officer who was now investigating her operation. The letter was polite but firm, acknowledging his own mistakes while making it clear that he wouldn't be intimidated into silence. The photos never appeared. Whether Monteira decided the risk wasn't worth the reward, or whether she simply moved on to easier targets, Kevin never knew. He blocked her on all social media, changed his email address, and instructed his bank to flag any international transfers as potentially fraudulent. The return to England was harder than Kevin had anticipated. Manchester felt grey and cold after months of tropical heat, and his apartment seemed impossibly small after the expansive horizons of Koh Samui. But more challenging than the physical adjustment was the psychological work of rebuilding his identity and self-respect. Kevin entered therapy with a counselor who specialized in fraud victims and romantic exploitation. The sessions were difficult, forcing him to examine not just what had happened in Thailand, but why he'd been so vulnerable to manipulation in the first place. His divorce from Sarah hadn't just ended his marriage. It had shattered his confidence in his ability to form genuine connections with other people. The loneliness that had driven him to Thailand ran deeper than Kevin had realized. Years of focusing on work at the expense of personal relationships had left him emotionally starved and desperate for validation. Monthira had provided exactly what he craved: attention, admiration, and the illusion of being needed and valued by someone beautiful and young. The therapy helped Kevin understand that his experience in Thailand was part of a larger pattern of emotional avoidance that had characterized most of his adult life. He'd thrown himself into his architectural career as a way of avoiding the harder work of maintaining intimate relationships. When his marriage began to fail, he'd worked longer hours rather than addressing the underlying problems. When the divorce became inevitable, he'd fled to Thailand rather than processing the grief and loss. Recovery involved more than just healing from Monthira's deception. It required Kevin to rebuild his ability to trust his own judgment, to form healthy relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate need, and to find sources of meaning and validation that didn't depend on other people's approval. The process took almost 2 years. Kevin reduced his work schedule, joined social groups for divorced professionals, and slowly began dating again. The relationships were cautious and deliberate, built on friendship and shared interests rather than intense passion and immediate intimacy. Kevin learned to recognize red flags that he'd ignored with Monthira: excessive flattery, rushed intimacy, financial requests, and isolation from friends and family. More importantly, Kevin learned to value his own company. He took up hiking, rediscovered his love of reading, and began volunteering with a local organization that helped fraud victims navigate the legal system. Helping other people who'd experienced similar exploitation gave Kevin a sense of purpose that his architectural work had never provided. The unexpected ending came during Kevin's third year of recovery. He was volunteering at a fraud awareness seminar when he met Margaret, a retired teacher who'd been victimized by an online romance scam. She was intelligent, warm, funny, and completely uninterested in Kevin's money or professional status. Their friendship developed slowly over months of shared volunteer work and casual coffee dates. Margaret had also been divorced, had also made mistakes in trusting the wrong person, had also spent years rebuilding her sense of self-worth after betrayal. She understood Kevin's wariness about relationships, his need for transparency and honesty, his determination never to be vulnerable in the same way again. Their romance, when it finally developed, was nothing like Kevin's experience in Thailand. It was built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine compatibility rather than fantasy and manipulation. Margaret challenged Kevin intellectually, supported his emotional growth, and maintained her own independence and interests. When they moved in together after 2 years of dating, it felt like a partnership between equals rather than a rescue mission or a business transaction. Kevin still thought about Thailand sometimes, but the memories no longer carried the sting of humiliation and betrayal. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he'd traveled, not just geographically, but emotionally. The man who'd been seduced and exploited on Koh Samui had been desperate and broken. The man who'd built a healthy relationship with Margaret was confident, self-aware, and genuinely happy for the first time in decades. The final validation came 3 years after Kevin's return from Thailand. He received an email from a British tourist who'd found his name in an online forum for fraud victims. The man had been targeted by the same operation that had exploited Kevin, but armed with information from Kevin's warnings and police reports, he'd recognized the scam early and escaped without financial loss. Kevin realized then that his experience in Thailand, as painful as it had been, had served a purpose beyond his own education. By refusing to pay the blackmail, by reporting the crime, by sharing his story with authorities and support groups, he'd helped protect other vulnerable people from similar exploitation. That's the most important lesson from Kevin's story. Recovery from betrayal isn't just about healing yourself. It's about using your experience to help others avoid the same mistakes. If you know someone who seems too good to be true, if you have a friend making financial decisions based on a romantic relationship they can't quite explain, if you recognize the warning signs of emotional manipulation, speak up. Trust your instincts, even if it means having difficult conversations. Kevin's story isn't unique. Every year, thousands of people fall victim to romance scams and emotional exploitation. The tactics may vary, the locations may change, but the underlying vulnerability remains the same: loneliness, desperation for connection, and the willingness to believe that love can conquer all obstacles. Protection comes from community, from maintaining connections with friends and family who can provide objective perspective when passion clouds judgment. It comes from understanding that genuine love develops slowly, built on trust and compatibility, rather than intense chemistry and urgent need. It comes from recognizing that anyone who isolates you from your support network, who rushes intimacy, or who needs financial assistance early in a relationship may not have your best interests at heart. Most importantly, protection comes from self-awareness and self-respect. When you know your own worth, when you have sources of meaning and validation beyond romantic relationships, when you trust your own judgment and instincts, you're less likely to fall for elaborate deceptions designed to exploit your vulnerabilities. Kevin Marshall learned these lessons the hard way, but he learned them thoroughly. His life today is richer, more authentic, and more genuinely happy than it ever was during his 2 months in paradise with Monthira. The tropical beaches were beautiful, but the relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection in grey, rainy Manchester turned out to be worth infinitely more. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories of survival, recovery, and the resilience of the human spirit. Leave a comment telling us about your own experiences with trusting your instincts or helping a friend recognize a dangerous relationship. Have you ever had to choose between comfortable lies and difficult truths? Your stories might help someone else recognize warning signs before it's too late. And remember, the most beautiful prisons are still prisons, and the most convincing lies are still lies. Trust yourself, protect yourself, and never be afraid to ask for help when something feels wrong.